Hello and welcome to what will be the concluding dialogue in this pilot series of Reboot Dialogues. We started in October, on the 26th of October, with the case for a world security community of democratic nations, and have since looked at destructive global competition, European federalism, and last week at the Bildung Rose model of a functioning society by Lene Rachel Anderson. We've decided to conclude with today's dialogue this pilot series because it's been an enormous learning curve, not least on my part, but also we now know what it looks and feels like to run Reboot as a live show, and there's so much we can do to improve it. We will change the interface, if you like, the viewer experience will improve, will get better. We also have getting a better sense of the kind of topics we want to cover, and we want to become more proactive in inviting people from all around the world to take part in these dialogues. So we will come back with Reboot 2030 on the 1st of February next year, which again is a Tuesday. We stick to that Tuesday schedule every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Central European Time. So on the 1st of February next year, we continue with hopefully what will be a block of 10 new Reboot dialogues. We already have some really interesting people, I wouldn't say lined up, but sort of on the radar, who expressed great interest in participating. So hopefully with some luck, it'll be a really informative and hopefully also some entertaining series of dialogues. The intention then is to really, in a way, mirror the British sort of academic system, where you have 3 terms. And in each of those terms, we would have 10 weeks, and we would have 1 Reboot dialogue each week. So hopefully next year, starting on the 1st of February, we'll have a block of 10 dialogues, then a short break, then another block of 10 dialogues, and then a summer break, and a final concluding block of 10 dialogues in the autumn. And hopefully we will be able to take this through all the way to 2030. So that's where we are, and that's how we move forward. But let me now introduce our today's guest, Young-Jin Choi. He is head of research in impact investing at Finio AG. And Finio are special in the sense that they're not for profit. So this is not your kind of run-of-the-mill management consultancy, although they are very much management consultants and investment consultants, but they are coming to this from a very different angle. Young-Jin, he, as I said, he is involved in impact investing. And what exactly that means, he will tell us in a minute. Before he joined Finio, he was a senior strategy consultant with Monitor, a global strategy, or some would say it's a boutique consultancy, but quite large and with global reach, and hyper commercial. And before then, he was with 3M as an investment manager within their corporate venturing unit. So Young-Jin really has come from a classic finance business background, but has moved across in what I would consider a far more life-affirming arena. And he's also become a little bit of an activist, or I should say really quite an activist. So today he will introduce this notion of carbon pricing and what exactly carbon pricing is and why this is so important. He will, of course, also explain to us. But the idea is that in a world that is really spiraling out of control in terms of climate change, we need to have far more effective means of bringing down, of decarbonizing our atmosphere if we want to have any chance of reaching a livable level of global warming. Carbon pricing is a highly effective method of contributing to that, but it also has its downsides. And politically, it is probably quite hard to push through because it means higher prices. If you put a price on carbon emitting products like petrol and others, then people have to pay more for these goods. But on the other hand, if you were, and this is what he's talking about, if you were to introduce a climate income, in other words, if you would redistribute a substantial portion of the money you take in through the carbon pricing scheme and redistribute that equal shares to all, then actually that could somehow cushion. In fact, what Young-Jin will show us, lower income groups would actually come out with more money at the end of the month. And of course, it would be a way of really sustainably driving forward a decarbonizing agenda. So I can see that Young-Jin is waiting in the waiting room. So do bear with me and let me admit him in. Okay, there we go. So let's see how this goes. Is he coming on board? Yes, there is it. Young-Jin, are you there? There you are. Hi. I'm glad you're here. Yesterday we still spoke German, and today we are speaking English. For you, I don't know, do you speak much English in your everyday life?
No, not so much actually. Although I've several colleagues, not within my work context, but outside of it, in the climate context, where I speak English oftentimes.
Okay, so I'll give you a little bit of sort of warming up time to get into the language. I said a few things about Reboot first and where we're headed, but then also a very short introduction about you. That you've come from quite a, what I call sort of a classical MBA finance business background, working for Monitor, a big sort of icon within the kind of competitive strategy world, and then moving across to 3M, I guess, leveraging some of your strategy expertise into investment banking, corporate venturing. But at some point you have had enough of it, and the sort of purely commercial approach wasn't enough for you anymore. And so you took a different route and you joined Afenial, which is, as I understand it, a not-profit consultancy, advising both on managerial and on strategy issues, but also on investment. Isn't that?
Almost, yes. I mean, the focus of Afenial is impact measurement, management, impact orientation in general, with emphasis on philanthropy, non-profits, foundations, but also including investors. I mean, philanthropy and investing oftentimes is not too far away from each other. Yeah.
That's right. So you have come from really quite a sort of a commercially profit-driven environment, efficiency-driven environment, and you have moved from that productivity-driven environment, and you've moved from that to a very, very different world, a very different environment. Tell us a little bit about your background and what that journey looked like, and why you have ended up doing what you're doing right now.
Sure, yeah, happy to do so. I mean, I think you can say maybe it started with the first important choice you have to make after you finish school, what to study. And at that time, it was 1998. We were told, that engineering is so important and providing safe jobs and so on. And I went for engineering, mechanical engineering in Aachen, and then also studied in parallel in Maastricht international business studies. And that's actually where a couple of courses I found very valuable. There was one on system dynamics. There was one on global inequality. Quite enlightening. And also during my mechanical engineering study, whenever I had some time, I visited some philosophy, ethics courses. And actually, there was even in the beginning subject that interested me a lot. But I, took a different path, and I wonder how my life would be if I had, studied philosophy, political philosophy, ethics. But anyway, I think I'm pretty glad that I ended up where I am now, and I couldn't have planned it. And when I was with Monitor, I also pursued my passion, in a way, by signing up for this politics, philosophy, and economics study at LMU, which was also something that I enjoyed a lot, even though it didn't provide me with, credentials that I could use in a corporate context. It's really sort of personal development in a way. Yeah, I mean, and then when I was in a corporate VC world, what I found interesting was that we didn't purely invest for financial return, but for strategic value too. So for non-financial outcomes, so we thought about how to measure, how to manage for these outcomes. And so when I became more interested in impact investing, it's there's some similarities how to measure non-financial.
Absolutely, but all the while, I mean, just to dramatize it a little bit, all the while the planet was heating up around us, and I suppose the whole sort of climate change debate kind of began, certainly in the last 5 to 10 years, began to move more and more into the foreground and started to kind of, in a way, challenge people's thinking and also people's actions. And how did that kind of influence you, or how did that kind of make you kind of, did it have an impact on your trajectory? Or
surely. So I mean, already shortly after I finished studying, so I think there was one influential, or several actually influential books, but there's one by Erich Fromm, To Have or To Be. It's a classic, really good. There was also The Corporation that came out, by Joel Bacon, who analyzed if corporations were persons, at that time, early, I think end of early 2000s, or even before that, and so that they would be characterized as sociopaths by due to their reckless behavior. But and then recently a new book came out, The New Corporation, where he kind of did an update. Now, but so I was already skeptical of the let's say purely profit maximizing kind of capitalism at that time, and I followed the early COPs, and the early negotiations for climate treaties, and I assumed it was early 21st century, right? I assumed that over time reason would prevail, we would find a solution, but it was quite shocking to realize, maybe 3 years ago, that we have massively failed to transform or decarbonize our economic systems, and that somehow much more is needed. So I would say I wrote my thesis on politics, philosophy, and economics in 2012 about the limits to growth, in a way, and game theory. So I was quite aware of the challenge, but it was still frustrating to see over the past 10 years how little has changed, even though the urgency, the climate science also has evolved a lot. So it's bizarre, that we haven't seen much more, much more determination.
That's right. I mean, if you were to kind of use a bit more sort of business lingo, you could sort of say that we have massively sort of overstated, if you like, the kind of one side of the balance sheet. We've been massively focusing on income and on profit maximization, but we have kind of in a way neglected or even kind of excluded liabilities and costs that if we were to include them, we would be looking at very different profitability profiles, across industry and also across services increasingly. And so I guess what we're saying is that we have to, it's not so much that we have to move away from profit maximizing doctrine, although some would think that would be a good idea, but that's actually not at the core of your thinking, is it? I think what you are saying is it is time that we really account for all the costs. And if we can then still make a fair profit, so be it, and that's great. So we're not against making a profit, but we do want, in all fairness, to be, cost to be included. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, with maybe some caveats, but the analysis that right now that we're seeing a massive market failure, because external costs are not internalized in market prices, is persistent, has been, and this is the amazing thing, for 30 years perhaps, it became more and more emergent, and actually for the past 10 years maybe, it's really relatively certain that there is a huge market failure. But early I think early environmental movements already pointed this out 30 years ago, and so we have this insufficient response to this for that time period. But yeah, but totally right. And it's about the correlation between profitability and real world outcomes and positive, negative environmental and social impacts. That is the problem. And markets are not supposed to be that dysfunctional and self-destructive, one could argue, right? So if we can correct and create realign markets so that profitability correlates with impact, with positive impact and negative in the right way, I think then we can even, the Friedman doctrine, right? He wrote this paper about the responsibility of corporations. And at that time when he wrote it, I think it was in the 70s, late 70s, last century. At that time, there wasn't such a big, the market failure wasn't that apparent. And I'm sure that even Friedman would have argued that we have to change the legal framework and the way markets, are incentivized. And if that could be changed, then we could even, I think even Friedman would be happy, or in a way, we could still pursue the quest for, optimal returns and profits without having all these negative, impacts.
That's right. So I guess sort of leading on to the topic of today's talk is that what you're proposing is very, very much within the kind of idiom of markets. So you're not suggesting we should kind of, regulate outside of markets or impose some kind of sort of, if you like, market ignorant kind of instrument, but you're sort of saying we need to somehow rectify the kind of failure that exists within markets. So this notion of carbon pricing, in a way, what it does, I mean, I'm talking from a sort of a layman's perspective, and you can correct me on this, but what carbon pricing really says is we have to add, if you like, we have to kind of add to the cost side of it. We have to make carbon more expensive because we're not really, the market by in itself doesn't really take account of our costs. So if you raise the cost of producing carbon or producing carbon heavy goods and services, and then we have to factor that in. So, and that, the hope goes, that would then somehow rebalance that kind of like equation. Isn't that a fair way of putting it?
Indeed, it would correct for this market failure. It is in fact what economists have been proposing for a long time, right? And we have seen it work in other contexts too. I mean, but I would say it's a pragmatic approach from my personally. I think it's has a lot to do about what we value, how we there are different types of capital. There's a different definition of success. There are limits to growth, but in the climate crisis is providing us with a very narrow window of opportunity. And so I thought about what's the fastest way to transform our economic system. And there is a lot to say about how do we measure progress? It's not GDP, right? It's very, very insufficient measure of progress. And it's also cannot be perpetual growth, on a limited, finite planet. But in the near term and midterm, the fastest way to transform markets is to use market forces and redirect them into the right direction, where they're supposed to work.
Of course, there is a problem, isn't there, with if you like, pricing carbon, because it's a sort of a tax, isn't it? And if you do that, and I'm just thinking, for example, value added tax, which is another kind of sort of consumer tax, if you like. When you do that, you have a tax system that isn't progressive. So if you are poor, imagine a larger portion of your income will go on consumable products that by definition consume carbon or produce carbon, like petrol, if you have to drive to work and so forth. So one of the key arguments could be from a sort of, if you like, a social justice perspective, that taxing carbon will hit the poor much harder than the rich. And the solution that you and others put forward to address that issue is this notion of a climate income. Could you just maybe explain that idea within the context of social justice?
Yeah. So I think there's different challenges when we think about carbon pricing, and it's regardless whether we price carbon through fees or taxes or through emissions trading, and limited rates to emissions. But the effect is the same, that products with particularly high emissions become more expensive, and they are supposed to become more expensive because we want to change behavior, consumer behavior, producer behavior. The beautiful thing about carbon pricing is that it doesn't just address the supply side or the demand side, but it's supposed to address both sides. So in the end, products and services will become more expensive if they, actually have these damaging side effects in the long term. So, but we have to be careful about how we go about this transition, and how, most importantly, we can ensure the support from the general public. Right, so we have this
democracy that is really important. Yes,
indeed. We have time pressure on the one hand, really, and it's becoming more urgent every year. On the other hand, we have this inertia, so populations need time to adjust and change their behavior, and this will be so. On the one hand, the carbon pricing mechanism should be well designed so that prices increase at a steady rate, or that they are predictably high. So they don't have to be high from the beginning, right? But they have to be, they have to have this visible trajectory so that you can plan ahead. So, in 10 years, it's going to be really expensive.
You have to tighten the screw over time that we actually get the changed behavior that
so
we want to see.
Kind of leave some room for transition. But even then, the carbon pricing is ineffective if it doesn't provide strong enough incentives, right? So it has to be, but on the other hand, with the carbon pricing mechanism, what you have to consider is also that low carbon products and services become much more attractive and competitive, right? And so they need to be available in sufficient supply as well, right? And there's also some transition needed to scale up production in this regard. So, but the key reason why what we're talking about, climate income, is we generate revenues, through pricing carbon, and the idea is to redistribute a substantial share of these revenues to the consumer households, right? Fairly, equally, maybe by head count or family size and so on, but in a way so that households are supported financially to better cope with the price increases and adjust their behavior, right?
Okay, so just to get this very clear, so people pay for the if you like the additional the markup on the carbon through the products they buy and the services they buy, but they get this money back. Now, but if I understand you correctly, everybody gets the same amount. So it's not based on consumption. It's not the more carbon I consume, the more money I get back. Isn't that correct?
Well, it's the simplest way to redistribute in an equitable way, right? So in a way, it's similar to universal basic income. I mean, we'll talk about this a bit, right? But it's I think for example, as every household or every person in a household gets annually 3,000 euros. I mean, depending on the price level, how much revenues is generated, if it's going to be redistributed. But if you there's several models that show that the lower income household groups they benefit disproportionately, right? For them, this kind of amount is a significant increase of their disposable income, and in fact, more than half, maybe even 2/3, should be better off even financially. They get more every year than they have to pay more through price increases, and if they change their behavior, they have even more left, right? So
that's right. So for example, if I can't afford to have a big SUV car, which is beyond my means because I don't have the income, I then also don't have the petrol bill. I don't have to pay. So, but I still get the same money as my neighbor who drives that big SUV, and of course may have to use this additional income to pay for the petrol or the increase in price of the petrol. So it's like, because you are consuming less, but you're getting the same money as anybody else. You're relatively speaking, you're benefiting disproportionately. Isn't that correct?
Lower income households tend to have also a lower carbon footprint. They'll be less affected by price increases, relatively speaking. but still, they have different challenges. They cannot simply change their behavior overnight. Maybe there's some, and this is maybe a challenge indeed. There's some investments needed, to buy an electric vehicle. So this is why carbon pricing in itself is probably not enough. For certain, not enough. There's a whole a broad range of regulatory measures, and
you need
pricing is just one tool
of
the toolbox. For example, what would be really helpful in addition to carbon pricing is smart, public financing support, so that you can, make these kind of expenditures at zero interest rate, for example, and then it becomes more affordable this way. If you're a house owner, you want to put photovoltaics on top, of your house, plus an electric vehicle, plus install a heat pump, for example, and all these ideally without financing costs, it becomes much more attractive to do so and much more feasible, right?
It does, but the interesting thing, of course, is again there's a balance to be struck, isn't there? So because if the cake is whatever size it is, and I can either redistribute that to the general population, or I can say I only distribute, for the sake of the argument, 1/3 of the cake and 2/3 of the cake I use for these other measures. And of course, there must be, in a way, because of course, as a politician, I'll be thinking, that's great. I can promise all these additional services, all these kind of inducements, but of course, the money needs to come from somewhere.
The challenge is the climate income needs to be sufficiently high to compensate or more than compensate price increases. So there's not too much, room for other uses. I know that in the context of carbon pricing, there are various proposals for how to use the revenues, for, payroll, tax incentives, or, for green investments and green, development corporation spending. I mean, it's all very much needed, but I would argue it needs this, especially infrastructure investment is needed, but it needs to come from other sources. We need this climate income just to ensure that the population is supported. And we're not talking just about the poorest households. It's also starting to affect middle-income households once the price levels reach, prices increase, and prices have to increase at a steep curve. So how can you maintain that, support if prices reach significant levels? And, without the climate income, I think it's predictable that there will be too much, resistance, frustration, and, So this is, I think, the main reason why we're using price revenues for this purpose is so critical. And there's a whole other discussion about how to mobilize the funding we need, to make all these investments that are so much needed, But there's a smart way to use public spending. There's a certain fiscal space that I think is underutilized. I mean, we can have another discussion probably about how to mobilize that funding.
That's right. So there's an interesting argument that we said we need to kind of we need to have almost like a firewall. We have to have a clear separation of purposes, if you like. So what we're sort of saying is yes, we need to have multiple substitution effects where people substitute high carbon generating goods for low carbon generating or no carbon or indeed carbon consuming goods. So we need to have that substitution. We need to shift people from a sort of like carbon producing destructive kind of path onto another path. So for that we need to kind of provide inducements. We need all sorts of things. We need to kind of support the kind of a greening of the economy and all the rest. That can't be the sole responsibility or even at all the responsibility of the carbon income, because the purpose of the carbon income is very specific. The purpose of the carbon income is to say we need to help those who cannot afford those price hikes to basically somehow either change their behavior or to subsidize those price hikes. Otherwise, it's like, turkeys voting for Christmas, as you say, as the saying goes. You won't get in a democracy people sustainably over long periods of time to vote for policies that make them poorer. because it's democratically very difficult. Even if it's sort of seen as important, it's very hard to sustain that. And it's also a very hard case for politicians to push because they want to get reelected.
Well, in a context where the level of urgency awareness is still relatively limited, I would argue. I mean, you can see a shift in the, different almost maybe I would say levels of consciousness, or so people who understand the necessity to to make a transition in the personal lives. And actually for many people it's beneficial. It's Saul Griffiths is making the argument that it's even for the economy, it's actually hugely beneficial. You save expenses, every year. You create jobs, well-paid, decent jobs, and so on. But aside from that, I think the level of urgency awareness of the kind of responsibility that our generation has, for the future generations, is still not as highly, widespread as it should be, right? So I think this will change over time, but it's not quickly enough. And so in the meantime, we need to ensure support through other means, Yeah.
Absolutely. So how long has this notion of carbon pricing has been around for quite some time, as you said, in various guises. But the idea of a climate income is not so old. It's a more recent idea, I believe. Can you tell me a little bit about how this idea came into being? Who the organizations or maybe even the political parties are that support that notion, and what the state of affairs is when it comes to climate income? Is there much resistance in the world of politics, in the world of business? How is this being looked at the moment?
Yeah. Well, so the history is certainly interesting, and I have to say I don't know it too well. So my context, how I came to this proposal, is through the Citizens Climate Lobby, CCL, an organization that is based in the US. Not sure quite how many years ago it was formed, but initially it started in the US. It was also supported by James Hansen, famous climate scientist, and and they also went on to gather bipartisan support, right? And so it's something that usually appeals to both political parties in the US. Today it's it has also changed a bit, but still. I think that was one of the early proposals and activist organizations arguing for it. There's over time they expanded, so they also formed a German group, and in other countries there's a European group. So the general idea is, of course, it has to be applied in different regions in the world, and I think that there also has been a lot of resistance, or it's not easy to implement a sufficiently steep carbon pricing scheme. We can see that emissions trading in the EU for many years didn't really work or reach price levels that are sufficient. That's now changing as well, or it's increasing at a certain rate at least, but globally carbon pricing is still totally underutilized, right? But we can see increased momentum, especially in recent years, especially for example, the IMF is promoting carbon pricing a lot, right? And its studies or policy packages that include carbon pricing as well as public spending. So the combination matters a lot as well. So I think the general acceptance has increased and is continuing to increase. It's still politically a challenge, but maybe also because the concept of a climate income, so not just carbon pricing, but in combination with the climate income, is not very common indeed. But what I can refer to is the econ statement, so the statement of economists in the US that also support carbon pricing, and they also argue in favor of a climate income, for example.
I mean, it's my sense that you almost can't have one without the other. There's a real block. I mean, certainly it would be very hard to take that into a kind of a party political manifesto for an election, so to say, well, vote for higher energy prices, you know, and you know, it's going to be very difficult. But on the other hand, if you have it as a package, then you could make it work. There is one thing which I find interesting, and is that it's, of course, it's not, carbon income wouldn't be means tested, and anything that isn't means tested, be it a universal basic income or would it be a climate income, is always viewed with suspicion. There is a sort of a sufficient level of understanding that this isn't about giving money to people who don't need it, but this is about, statistically speaking, sort of rebalancing the playing field in a way. It's not easy to communicate, but I think that's from my understanding, one of the hurdles. This isn't money for nothing. There's a clear return on this. That's one thing. And the other, you know, with the means testing, and the other thing, and I guess this kind of goes back to sort of, you know, what people refer to as the Protestant work ethic. This is something people haven't necessarily worked for. So if you work hard and you earn good money, then you earned it. But if you just get it because you're like a citizen of a particular country that has that scheme, then it's a sort of, you know, some people will say, but somebody has got to pay for this, and then there's this, you know, so there's this problem. So but there is obviously a line of argument that I think could be quite powerful, and that's this idea to sort of say, well, actually, this is about supporting sort of hard-pressed consumers, because, you know, like I'd say, like, you have some kind of statistic, like on the website, like as part of your paper, that sort of shows the distribution of benefit. And I think what we see there is that there's more than 50% of the population will actually have a net gain from this. So I think that's a really interesting case to say, well, this is support. The majority of consumers are increasingly hard pressed to keep up with energy prices, to keep up with, well, any carbon heavy service, and so this is a way of countering that.
And there are actually examples, real world examples in Canada. I think it's particular British Columbia, and most recently in Austria. You know, there are early pilots, or I mean, it's not. We couldn't say it's pilots, because as a concept. There are, for example, in Canada, it has worked for many years now. But the, say, full-fledged implementation in combination with a high carbon pricing, maybe this needs to be developed still. But I find it difficult to imagine how a high carbon price should be acceptable, you know, without a climate income, right? So thinking about feasibility, political feasibility,
and social justice, because
and justice, yes,
as we said, because obviously the tab would be picked up on the whole. The lion's share of the tab would be picked up by hardworking people who basically just about make ends meet, and they now have to basically shoulder that. So I think it's a very hard sell,
and it's not free income, right? So because you have the price increases on the other hand, and you know, but more importantly, it's the incentive function that the better, you know, the more you change and shift your consumer behavior, the more you have left in the end as a net gain, right? So this is also another effect. Initially, when I heard about it, I wasn't sure whether it's not simply, you know, exchanging one for the other. What's the big incentive for households? But you have to take into account that it's also about shifting the competitive landscape and making low carbon, you know, climate solutions much more attractive. And so this is, I think, a key mechanism that's working in the background while you have,
I tell you, of course, one of the big challenges is if you take the universal basic income, and we have this in Germany at the moment, you can run a major pilot, because you can just give like 150 people a universal basic income for the next 3 years and see whether they turn into lazy couch potatoes, or whether they use that money and that freedom to do something really worthwhile that also benefits society. We can, and these pilots are now taking place on the universal basic income side to sort of see how does that play out if we do that. With a carbon dividend or a climate income, that's not really possible, is it? You can't really run it. You can't have a dry run. You have to go for the real thing from the start, because unless you raise carbon prices, there's no justification for the carbon dividend, and that makes it difficult. No,
and well, I mean, it's quite different from another. I mean, there are similarities, but we are not talking about replacing income for work. It's really adding to the annual income that households generate anyways. And also it's a temporary measure, so ideally, as we manage to decarbonize our societies, the revenues generated will also become lower, even though on the other hand, you have higher price levels,
that's right,
income, but we have also, in ideal, it will converge against zero again.
Diminishing returns, I think they call that, yeah.
And so when we are successful, we don't have to, we don't need to pay climate income anyways. And the demand, and what I also find important about it is that we don't underestimate the need to work on the demand side as well, and it's where a majority of emissions are also generated. And in this way, I totally agree with Saul Griffith. There's so much more that we as consumers, households, as house owners, but also, and this is another challenge, maybe in particular in Germany, is there's not a high share of house ownership compared to like the US. In comparison, it's lower, and we need to overcome this, structural incentive problem that you have when you're a house owner that is, and on the other hand, when you're just renting an apartment, you have less incentives to invest in, decarbonizing your lifestyle through choices that affect the building, heating system and so on. So this is maybe one thing on the structural side, and there are solutions to it too. There's, for example, a scheme where you offer temperature as a service, as a landlord, right? And so when you make investments that save you costs, you also incentive to do so because you benefit from them. On the other hand, as a consumer, you save money by just using less, heating, for example. Or otherwise it just stays the same for you. You don't even notice that the source of heating is going to become different. So these are peculiar challenges in Germany.
I mean, in a way, what makes this such a pressing problem is that if we don't get a handle on sort of runaway climate change, and if we don't really find a way of significantly speeding up decarbonization, which is at the heart of this, we end up in a world that nobody really wants to live in, and the window is closing. So this is, we can talk about this, until the cows come home, but at the end of the day, the window is closing. And when we set up Reboot 2030, we did this in the belief that we actually have this 10-year window till around about 2030, where a lot of decisions, including how we handle climate change in very clear and effective ways, is sort of instituted. Now, in my experience, unless there is an organization, like a structure, or ideally like some official state-based instrument, these things they will be debated. There'll be kind of academic conferences, there will be all these kinds of things, but to move from idea to implementation is a huge challenge. Now, to me, this sounds like a really interesting way also for consumers to actively participate in decarbonization. Now, how do we move from idea to implementation? What can I do? What can you do? What can other people do? Organizations like FINEO, what can organizations like Greenpeace, what can unions, trade unions, what can political parties do to get us there? What is the actual trajectory we're looking at to operationalizing this idea?
So I think there's a challenge that has many different layers, and the root causes of why we haven't done so earlier, are actually quite interesting to explore, but also can be frustrating, to see. I think, first of all, it's important to realize that market and technology forces are on our side. They're not fast enough right now, but it's going in the right direction, and we need this additional push. But the good thing about it is that there's actually quite a lot to gain as well, from investing into a transition. And on the other hand, there is, I think, a misperception with regard to the climate damages and risks, especially among policymakers. As there's just I'm reading a lot about also climate economics, and there's been a critic by Nicholas Stern about how climate economics needs to be updated because they underestimated, various aspects of climate risk and damages. So we need this kind of awareness building effort to make steep carbon pricing schemes more acceptable. We need to promote awareness about climate income as a way to ensure that it's also politically feasible. I still assume that the policymakers, the majority of them, may have not heard about it yet. So this is what Citizens Climate Lobby is trying to change by talking directly with policymakers. So training citizens to become lobbyists, for this cause, which is, I think, a powerful intervention that's needed and needs to scale as well. It's a matter of time. We need to accelerate it somehow. I see. So once we create, I think there's a certain threshold. I think there's some studies that show once like 20-25% of the population become activists or convinced of an idea, it starts to spread, but before that you don't notice much in terms of change.
Oh, I thought that threshold is much lower than that.
3.5% there's a threshold of 3.5% for non-violent civil resistance, to change systems.
Okay, I thought it was much lower. The figure I heard was around about 8%, but that's probably.
Okay, yeah, it's interesting it's fascinating literature anyway. I've seen 20%, but so this is a critical mass that you need to reach, and once you have reached it, things start to fall into place more quickly. The other aspect I think is interesting about climate income and carbon pricing in combination is you could start within a region. You don't have to start globally, but over time you can expand. And when you start within a region, of course, you have to prevent carbon leakage. You would do so through carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is the.
Could you that's really important. Could you very briefly explain what a sort of a carbon border adjustment, what that looks like? Because I think that's a critical issue.
Yeah. So in its simplest terms, you try to level the playing field, for exporters and for importers. You want to avoid that the carbon pricing that you charge within a region leads to substantial disadvantages competitively, and on the other hand, that importers benefit from having no carbon pricing, right? So you raise tariffs at the border, or you provide incentives for exporters.
So that's right. So what that really means, I mean, within the European context, we have got the single market, so you wouldn't really be able to do this, or would be very difficult to do this, say, only in Germany. So So we're looking when we're talking about regions, we're talking trading blocks.
Yes.
So we're talking probably NAFTA, we're talking probably European Union, we're talking, but this already makes it a lot more manageable, doesn't it? Because now we can say, well, okay, we can lobby the European Commission, we can lobby the European Parliament, we can use mechanisms, like citizen initiatives and all the rest that already exist at the European level to raise awareness, but also to kind of to force politicians' hands.
Yeah, and once you start, and maybe you form coalitions, climate clubs, for example, but more regions also have an incentive to start raising carbon prices too, to manage carbon border adjustments. I mean, the challenge is, of course, designing the mechanism well, and there's still challenges about, the quality of data that is maybe needed to find fair adjustments. It needs to be WTO compliant, but it's all, as far as I can tell, doable. And so, I think this is one big advantage of being able to start within the region and then expand from there on.
And there's when you sort of said the fine tuning and the kind of the fairness arguments of finding, I kind of buy this argument to a certain extent. But if you said that against the fairness issues compared to future generations, so we don't do anything, they kind of pale into insignificance. So yes, there are definitely fairness issues, and this thing would need fine tuning. There's no question about this. but to sort of to use that as an argument for not getting going. And I know you're not saying this, but this could come from the kind of the climate cynics. They sort of they would kind of really zoom into the detail and say, well, what about this? What about that? And the delay strategy, you know, and.
Yeah, you could argue that within the context of such a massive market failure that we are seeing at the, you know, at the disutility of future generations, it's really difficult to argue for market neutrality and you know, non-competitive or market distortions when the market is so distorted already. And you can also, I think, it's really not. It's difficult to argue that. You know, climate policies, in particular, like fiscal spending, would be a burden for future generations when the actual burden is being created through the market failure that we are currently not addressing.
Yeah. That's right, and I mean, one of the big challenges I've had with any complex problem, not just climate change, is that it's very hard to sort of see. You know, because there's sort of a threshold, isn't there, where you all of a sudden make real progress. But to get to that threshold, it can take years, and there's so much resistance at so many levels and in so many different ways that it can seem quite hopeless. And there is this kind of idea, if you can't measure the progress you make, you're going to get to this point where you're going to say, oh, well, we're not getting on with this. We're not. So how can we, you know, how could we kind of in a way create a mechanism, a system where we kind of find a way of saying, okay, this is where we stand with, you know, carbon pricing and with a climate income right now, and we're still this much away from actually implementation. But let's define some, you know, like some landmarks, some stages that we need to hit to get closer. Are there any such sort of positions that we would have to reach, or how could we, if you try to mobilize, because it's an all or nothing, isn't it? It's like until it's done, nothing is done. And so the question is, how can you kind of break this down into smaller bits? One aspect, of course, we've already discussed, is that we can have border adjustments. So we can already make this a much more manageable problem by saying, so well, actually, no, we don't have to wait for the Chinese. We can do this, you know, and we don't have to wait for the Americans. We can do this in Europe. And if they want to keep trading with us, then they have to go through that border adjustment mechanism, and they will then trade with us on equal terms again. So we can, but there must be other kind of ways in which we can sort of say, this is the way we make this manageable, and this is how we can measure our progress a step at a time, that we move closer. Can you think of any ways and strategies that we could develop to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I was initially thinking about the probability of certain policies to be implemented. You can argue that it's becoming more and more probable. You know, it's difficult to quantify, of course, but the challenge is that we spoke about this tipping point threshold. You know, once we reach a certain critical mass, there's a jump in the probability of certain policies to be implemented. For example, if you look at the but I think what we can look at more reasonably is the general population survey, and how many of the, you know, there's, you know, this framework which has the early adopters, the innovators, early adopters, the early majority, the late majority, right? It's also comparable to this survey that is conducted by, I think, by Yale Communication, you know, about the climate awareness and how that shifts over time. So when we see an early majority becoming more and more, you know, activists and starting to become innovators, right, reaching that stage, and then we can monitor. I think this is actually an interesting metric to follow. Another one could be, you know, if you look at the European emissions trading system, carbon price is reaching higher levels. It's getting closer to the social cost of carbon, you know, which is estimated. It did various estimates, but for, I think it's safe to assume between 100 and 200 euro per ton at least, you know, something like that. We're getting there, you know. We have to just keep in mind that with emissions trading in particular, there are also free allowances, and the scope is not complete. There's a limited scope, you know, so it's not reflecting the average price of carbon emissions in the EU yet. But still, we see progress, and I think there should be some, you know, once we reach a certain threshold, it could also become, change very quickly. So we have this uncertainty about when do we reach the threshold where things start to change very quickly. We just know that we are getting closer.
There is sort of there's kind of I think two levels where we could sort of kind of begin to measure or think about measuring progress, because I think this is going to be really, really important to do that. If you don't do that, we're really kind of flying blind. So I think there's a real need, and also that'll again have its own momentum. So if you had a website that would basically kind of give these, in a way, quantifies them like a like a countdown thing, how far are we away from that? And obviously that could be refined, but it would be quite a strong, I mean, the other, just to kind of say that is there's at the European level, there's like among sort of European federalists and kind of also within the Commission, I believe there's a kind of a debate around European taxation. That the Commission or the European Union should be able to tax to generate an income. I mean, like for the EU, ever to become a fully fledged sort of federation, that would be one of the next really important steps. And different taxes are in discussion here. One, of course, is a digital tax, as you're probably aware of, where they would be taxing bytes. Another is the Tobin tax and a transactions tax, which is also being debated that this would have to be implemented at the European level. Then there could be a carbon tax, and this is where where it leads back to our discussion here. And so, and these discussions are happening at a European level, and there are networks who are pushing for this for their own reasons. They see the benefit of having this extra funding to do stuff. Now, if you had a European carbon dividend, think about this, because you have take the Greeks or the Bulgarians and compare them to the Germans in terms of their income and also their carbon footprint, of course. Yeah. So when you're talking distribution within Germany, then you're talking, like somebody who might be sort of aufstocken, like somebody who receives maybe like, Hartz IV in one form or another as the poor person. But if you look at the sort of European level, then you're looking at a much greater kind of income differential, or if you like, sort of poverty gap between rich and poor. And this could be one way also to bring Europe closer together, because it would have another powerful effect. The high carbon producing parts of Europe, like Germany, France, Northern Italy, they would also be paying the lion's share of that carbon pricing.
Yeah, particularly of Poland, Eastern European countries too. The challenge is though that each country has a lot of autonomy still, or the European Union is not as cohesive yet, and depends a lot on all member states agreeing, and but I think it's a structural challenge. We sort of need to manage well, to get to where we need to be. As right now, it's an obstacle, to European implementation. So member states can, maybe they can be encouraged, to use carbon price revenues for climate dividend or climate income, but they cannot be mandated to do so.
No. Well, this is the thing. So this would require European legislation, and this would require buy-in of European member states. But I think what we are seeing, and of course, one could develop a kind of a European argument that benefits to poorer European countries, specifically in Eastern Europe and sort of the Mediterranean Europe. The benefits to them would also be significantly greater than to the rich countries. And what you do find is that those poorer or countries also tend to be, on the whole, when you think about Poland, the Czech Republic, and so forth, they also tend to be, if you like, the more conservative, or but the benefits there possibly outweigh the costs significantly. So what I find the problem here often is that we have so many interrelating, interdependent problems that we can't really have a carbon pricing regime just in Germany because of the single European market. But if we want to have it at a European level, then we're basically opening another can of worms where we have to deal with all these other issues. So, but this is the world we live in, isn't it? So, I mean, I think when you are projecting sort of a trajectory forward, if you sort of say, well, carbon pricing, and very closely linked to that, a carbon dividend or climate income. It really is a crucial element and a very effective element within the kind of decarbonizing toolkit. Then the question then becomes, what is the most effective point where we have the most leverage? Is it by going after the European Commission? Is it to basically kind of drive Europe forward to further integration so that these things become possible? Or do we kind of, in a way, do it the other way around? That we're sort of saying we're focusing on, the decarbonization, and then that necessitates a further integration of Europe. From what side?
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine that for now. I mean, as long as the carbon price is relatively low, that means that the other regulatory, interventions need to be that much stronger. Actually, if you think about public spending or phase out mandates, they need to be stronger. If as long as carbon pricing is too low, but building on what we currently have, the emissions trading system. Expanding that, strengthening it. Maybe when we speak about carbon tax on top of it, trying to. There are different ways to get to increased carbon prices, and there are other ways, like if you think about what a ban is actually, banning certain products after a certain period, like in 5 or 10 years, we have this phase-out mandate. It's like an infinite carbon price, right? In a way, right? And so there's a spectrum of possible activities. But I wanted to mention, coming back to this earlier question about how to track progress, I think certainly looking at, on the one hand, how in media, news media, in social media, certain topics are being discussed with the sentiment, and the frequency of mentionings or articles that are being published is interesting as well. But in particular, the kind of political parties that make it the government, as after every election, this is the most crucial, perhaps, enabler. This is why the next couple of elections are going to be so important.
Well,
they are determining the space
really, when you think about it.
Yeah.
Because beyond that, we're beyond 2030, so there's only 2 more elections within that 10-year window. And that's going to take us up to 2032. So
majority of seats, looking at how the seats are being distributed within the political spectrum is maybe one of the other important,
So, Young-Jin, if I would invite you back to have another reboot debate, like say in 6 months' time, 4, 5, 6 months' time. Of course, one of the problems at the moment, and this is a huge problem, and not for mankind, is that we are moving at a glacial pace. We're moving at such a slow pace. I mean, if you compare where we've been at COP25 and where we're now at COP26, you kind of wonder what happened in between, and so, what realistically can we expect if we had another talk in 4 or 5 months? What could we realistically expect to have changed, or how can we move the debate on, realistically speaking, within that kind of time frame? Given that we only have 10 years to bring about these changes, 6 months is actually a significant period of time when you think about it in those terms. So the question is what do you think, if we were to have another debate in 6 months or 5 months' time, what do you think we'd be picking this conversation? Would we have the same conversation again, or would we have moved on in certain respects?
It's a good question. Initially, when you mentioned 6 months, I was also wondering, thinking perhaps in 1 year, 2 years' time, maybe there's a significant difference to see. But I can only be hopeful. I mean, we have already, for example, the latest report by the IEA, World Economic Outlook 2021, was certainly different, very different in quality and substance from earlier reports. If you look 2 years, 3 years back, right? And so I'm hoping for a significant shift in the level of awareness within, large shares of the population, but in particular political leadership. I'm not sure whether we will see this. I mean, on the other hand, we have new coalition being formed in Germany. Still yet to be seen. I mean, this is the significant event perhaps that will distinguish today from the 6 months ahead. Maybe there were certain other signposts that might happen, but I would feel more confident if we spoke in a year's time to say, there should be visible signs of progress, hopefully.
What gives you that confidence? Yeah. Because if we would have spoken at COP25, you would have probably sort of said in 4 years' time, and look where we are. What gives you the confidence that if you don't achieve something in the next 6 months, we will achieve it in a year?
I mean, in terms of changing, we're talking about paradigm shifts that are taking place, and I just have a feeling, there's not empirical data to back it up, but 6 months is short, 1 year is, I think within a few years, this is maybe the time frame where, or it's speculative, maybe this kind of, we were talking about this tipping point threshold. Once it's reached, things will start to, change quickly.
To use a cliche, to use a cliche, this whole thing about green shoots, there has to be a spring before there can be a harvest. Things have to kind of, so I totally accept that we won't have significant change in 6 months' time. But what are the indicators we're looking for? What are, this is get back to the whole notion of progress.
Yeah.
What are the things that we're going to track? Are we just going to close our eyes and open them again in a year's time and see whether things look different? Or are we kind of actually tracking any indicators to see that things are moving in the right direction? I mean, if you take the current pandemic, imagine we wouldn't be doing any testing, and imagine, we wouldn't collect any data on the way that the pandemic develops. How would we know what's what and how things have developed and how this wave is different from the first or the second wave? And so in a way, I think what would be really interesting is if we come back and have another talk in 6 months or 5 months time, and we think about these indicators. We basically kind of, rather than sort of say, well, in 6 months' time, we're going to know it's all going to be better, but we're going to think about how we're going to measure progress over the next 10 years. How, because this is going to be such a crucial thing. There's a kind of a sort of a truism in management: what gets measured gets done. And if we don't have anything to measure, nothing is going to get done because there's no imperative. People will have to die on a large scale, and then we're going to measure bodies piling up. So I'd much rather measure something else. And wouldn't that be a kind of an interesting thing to do? That we meet again in 4, 5, 6 months next spring, and in the interim we think about about progress, how we're actually gonna basically, so that we don't have to repeat today's conversation.
Indicators of progress. Yeah, I mean, I like the idea, and I certainly like to think about it until next time. There's one thought though that comes to mind. There's also there need to be indicators of risk, and of resistance, because this is the thing about the dynamic system. The greater the signs of progress are, usually the resistance becomes higher as well. It's increasing, and we need to stay vigilant, and we need to address this. We need to fight resistance. So it's an ongoing struggle, but yeah. So we need more than just measures of progress. Yeah.
The other thing is like the other thing about indicators is that they are powerful political instruments. They can drive change. It's not only that they kind of have a motivational power in terms of telling people how they do, but it also has the like on the other end of the scale, there's a similar impact that it sort of shows our politicians how how ineffective we are at the moment, and it gives us arguments. It gives us something to make the case.
Yeah, you know, in the end, the final, as we know, the indicator that matters is the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, right? Which is not changing, or it's global temperatures which are not changing. These are the final, you know, indicators in the end that we try to influence. But in the interim, it's still very important to find the social indicators of social tipping points that are getting us there. And I just remember there's also an interesting paper that came out on specifically social tipping points. You know, maybe you know what I mean. Otherwise, I can send you a link to it. But it's you know, important to keep that in mind as well. Yeah.
So shall we kind of maybe part on that note that we're planning another sort of dialogue in 4 to 6 months time, and we will think about, you know, about measurement. We will think about how to measure progress and also failure. So that we get a much clearer sense, like a compass of where we are and how we move forward, and something that we could develop and refine over the next 5 to 10 years, so that we have that as a guide going forward, because then we can clearly measure against those indicators.
Let's do that.
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I'm always interested in general about measuring and managing the impact of at a systemic level, at a systems level, of systems change, you know, of systemic impact too. I mean, there's these also nuances and differences between systems change and systemic impact. Doesn't mean the same necessarily, but it's a topic in general that is currently I think becoming more and more important in the impact measurement and management world.
And there's another set of measurements, I think, which, you know, given your job, would be something we could include in this. And this is kind of measuring investment in kind of technologies that would drive change in the directions we want to see things go. So you know, in a way, because obviously that may also be be an indicator of tipping points and how things go. Young-Jin, thank you very, very much. It's been very, very interesting. And of course, as expected, there wasn't a big bang solution, or, you know, we haven't got there. We're at the very beginning of a process of a transformation from a sort of a carbon heavy to a carbon light or a decarbonized world.
And negative emissions afterwards. Yeah, this is not to forget. We need to.
And we're at the beginning of that journey, and so hopefully we'll have many more of these discussions. And I think as a first step, it would be great to talk about measurement, talk about indicators next time we meet. And of course, somebody like you who's very much coming from the kind of academic field and from the research field, it would be a very appropriate conversation to have.
Yeah, I would like that. Thank you very much, Nico. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much, and well, thank you very much for you know, engaging with this process. Thank you ever so much.
Cheers. Bye bye.
Talk to you again soon. Bye bye.